Hello and welcome, guys. This week we will be talking about lipids, which are fats, right? So fatty acids, fats, and we'll talk about all the different kinds of lipids and what their functions are. So first we're going to do a little bit of review before we jump into lipids. So go ahead and pause the video, work through some of these examples from last week, and we will go through them together. All right, so hopefully you were able to go through and get some of these examples. So what are some examples of monosaccharides? We talked about glucose, fructose, and galactose. And glucose is really the most important one, right? That's what our body prefers to use for energy. So we try to break everything down into glucose. Now, what are some examples of disaccharides? So disaccharides are just two monosaccharides put together. So that's sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And you guys can look up which two monosaccharides those disaccharides are made of. And then what are some of those polysaccharides? So polysaccharides are really just a chain of glucose, right? So our main ones that we find in plants are starch and cellulose, right? So that's how they store their energy. And then we store our glucose as glycogen for short-term storage, right, in the liver and a little bit in the muscle. But then we talked about storing glucose as fat as well. So we'll talk about that today. So starch, glycogen, and cellulose are our main polysaccharides, which are really just chains of glucose. And it just depends on how those glucose molecules come together, how they're bonded, whether we have some branching and things like that is going to change the shape of that polysaccharide, which is going to change the component of it, and it'll be a different molecule. So those are our three polysaccharides. Now we talked about some of the functions of carbohydrates in the body. The biggest one being energy, right? So glucose we plug into our cellular respiration, metabolism, and we create energy out of glucose. Now we can create energy out of different compounds as well, but we really like glucose because it goes straight into that first step of cellular respiration, glycolysis. But we also talked about a couple other things, right? So especially cellulose being a cell wall structure for plants. We talked about DNA and RNA as having those ribose and deoxyribose sugars, those 5 carbon sugar structures, creating the backbone for DNA and RNA. And then we also have some cell membrane components or structures that help with cell signaling, help stabilize the cell membrane and things like that. So we talked about those kind of glycoproteins, glycolipids, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in this lecture and the next lecture as well, because now we're going to cover kind of the lipid side and the protein side. Okay? So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to dive into the world of fat. And I think fat gets a really bad rap these days. There was a huge nutritional push back in the, probably 70s and 80s that went into this whole, low fat diet is good for you. And that's just kind of the mentality that people even have nowadays. But that's not necessarily true. There's a lot of different types of fats out there, and a lot of them are good for us, and we actually require fats in our diet. So we'll talk about those different types of lipids. We'll talk about those essential fatty acids that we actually absolutely need in our diet. And then we'll talk about what they do, right? The functions of lipids in the body, and how do we break them down? How do we metabolize lipids? And then we'll go into a little bit of the disorders with lipids as well. So there are lots of foods that are high in fat, and whether they're good fat or bad fat, we'll kind of talk about that. A lot of people, are scared of certain fats and what that actually means. Is it saturated or unsaturated? We'll go through all that good stuff. So what are lipids? So lipids are kind of the overall term for all these different fats, fatty acids, and things like that. And it's just a group of chemicals that are insoluble in water. So they don't break down in water, but they are soluble in organic solvents, such as ether, more like an alcohol substance. So you always hear about, oil and water doesn't mix, right? Because we cannot break down the oil or the lipid that makes up the oil in water, right? So they don't mix, and that's the definition of a lipid. So what are the lipids that we care about in terms of nutritional interest? So the big one is the fatty acids. So the fatty acids are these chains of carbon molecules. So we'll talk about fatty acids as well as triglycerides, which are fats. Okay, so fatty acids make up fats, and they're called triglycerides, are their technical term instead of fat. And it's made up of 3 fatty acids with a glycerol backbone. So we'll talk about those triglycerides. Another big category of lipids are phospholipids, and we'll talk about those guys because phospholipids make up our cell membrane. So all cell membranes are made up of phospholipids, and they are very important in our body because that's what makes up the cell membrane of all of our cells. So that's important. And then we'll talk a little bit about sterols, which make up steroids. So we'll talk about sterols and their importance in the body. So this is just an image of some of these compounds. So we have our fatty acids up in the upper left-hand corner. Glycerol, which is a type of alcohol, so it's not a fat, but we combine that glycerol with those fatty acids to get the triglyceride. So we have 3 fatty acid chains coming off of that glycerol backbone. Okay. Phospholipids, they look very similar, right, to the triglycerides, just a little bit different maybe on their chains, right? They also have that phosphate group on there. So instead of 3 fatty acids, we put a phosphate group on there. That's hence the phospholipid part, okay? And again, you're not going to need to know all of these compounds or chemical structures or anything like that, but it's just kind of to get you thinking about the chemical components of these lipids. And then we have sterols. Okay, so sterols are those hormones, cholesterol being one of the most important that we're going to talk about in our nutritional interest. So we do have other sterols as well, but we'll focus a little bit on cholesterol. Okay, so that just shows you that those fatty acids plus the glycerol makes the triglyceride. So now let's talk about specifically those different types of lipids in more detail. So our first group are the fatty acids. So they can be short, medium, or long chain carbon chains. So it just depends on how many carbons are in the chain, determines the length, right, of that fatty acid. So short, we also term volatile, and we talk about volatile fatty acids when we talk about our ruminant friends, because if we remember back, they use those volatile fatty acids as energy instead of glucose. The medium and long chain just have more carbons in a row, okay? So essentially the picture on the bottom left is showing the R group, which is that carbon chain, and attached to that carboxyl group, which is a double bound oxygen to that OH. Okay. So we have two different types of fatty acids. We have saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids. Now, a lot of people have a hard time remembering which is the good one, which is the bad one. So if you think about how many hydrogens are bound to the carbon, that's going to tell you whether it's saturated or unsaturated. So saturated means that all the carbons are bound to hydrogen. Okay, so if you look at that top picture on the right hand side, every carbon there in the chain has two hydrogens coming off of it, meaning it is saturated with hydrogens. Okay, saturated just means like full, right? Full of hydrogens. Now unsaturated, the carbons can double bond, meaning that instead of being bound to two hydrogens, it creates a double bond with another carbon. And if you notice, that's going to make a kink in that chain. So it's not going to be a nice straight chain of carbons. It's going to have a little kink. Now, depending on the length of the chain, you may have multiple double bonds, things like that. And so you may have more than one kink in the chain, but essentially any double bound carbon is going to give you an unsaturated fatty acid because it's not saturated with those hydrogens. Okay, so we'll talk about the differences here in a minute. So let's first talk about saturated fatty acids. Now these guys are solid at room temperature. So because they have the chain of carbons that's kind of flat, saturated with hydrogens, they can stack really closely together and they can become a solid compound, okay? So these guys are going to be found in your animal fats and your vegetable fats. Okay, so any sort of cream, cheese, milk, butter, fat that's found in meats, right? So animal fat is where we really are going to find those saturated fatty acids. But you can also find saturated fatty acids in some vegetable fat, okay? So coconut oil, palm kernel oil. So these are a lot of your oils, okay, that are actually solid at room temperature. If you ever, cook with coconut oil, you get a jar of coconut oil, it's solid at room temperature, right? So you have to kind of scoop it out. It's kind of like butter, right? Solid at room temperature. And then as soon as it gets any sort of heat on it, it melts, right? So there's a good article I have here kind of about the truth about fats, kind of the bad versus the good, because a lot of people, talk about coconut oil as being very healthy for you. So what's the difference between these saturated fatty acids? Because a lot of times the saturated fatty acids kind of get a bad rap, right? They're considered the quote unquote bad fats, right? So, that is the saturated fatty acid group. And now we have the unsaturated fatty acid group. So these guys are liquid at room temperature. Okay, so lots of our oils and things like that are going to be unsaturated. So we have two different types of unsaturated and as well. And so this depends on how many double bonds we have. So remember I said we have to at least have one double bound carbon, but we could have multiple, right? So it just depends on, say you have a really long chain and you have multiple double bound carbons, then it would be polyunsaturated. So it's going to be more than one double bound, and mono means only one double bond, okay? So that's the difference between mono and polyunsaturated. So mono just meaning one, poly more than one. Okay. And so you find some monounsaturated fats in like avocados, olive oil, canola oil, a lot of your oils. Polyunsaturated, also a lot of oils. So I'm not going to really ask you which ones are which, okay? Like which type of unsaturated fatty acid is avocado, right? Is it mono or poly? It's just to be aware of the difference between them, okay? They're both good for you. Unsaturated fatty acids are considered, you know, the good fats, okay? But if you hear around, you know, everybody's on this kick that you're not supposed to eat trans fats, right? So what are trans fats? What does that mean? Well, that has to do with this double bond. So if you have a double bond, right, of those two carbons, and it depends on what direction the hydrogens are attached to those carbons. So if you notice, the top picture has a cis fatty acid, meaning that the hydrogens are both on the same side, creating that classic kink that we talked about, okay? And that's good, right? So these kinks that are in the fatty acids, they keep the fatty acid from solidifying, okay, at room temperature, which is why they're mostly oils and things like that, okay? And you can create the oils from avocados and nuts as well. So it's the oils in those nutrients, in those vegetables and things, okay? Whereas the trans, if you notice, the hydrogens are across from each other. So it doesn't really have the same kink-like structure that cis fatty acid does. So that's the difference between trans and cis fatty acids. But again, it's why people are a little more concerned about trans fats, because they don't have the kink, so they're more like a saturated fat, I guess you could say. Okay. Okay, so now that we know about our different types of fatty acids, we can start creating these more complex compounds of fats or of lipids. So we have simple lipids and we have complex lipids, and these are all kind of considered fats, okay? So simple lipids are essentially those fatty acid chains. We have 3 of them, right? And we put them together with an alcohol, such as glycerol. So we have fats and oils, right? So those are our mono, di, and triglycerides. So the number, mono, di, and tri, just has to do with how many fatty acid chains. Okay, so you can have mono, just 1 fatty acid chain, di, 2 fatty acid chains, and tri, 3 fatty acid chains. Now these guys really account for most lipids in our foods, our mono, di, and triglycerides. Okay, so these guys are really what are in the oils and the butters and all that, okay? But we talked about the different fatty acids that make up these triglycerides, okay? Now we also have wax. So wax isn't really edible, but we do find these simple lipids make up wax. So wax is a type of lipid, interestingly enough, right? Now let's get into our complex lipids, okay? So these guys are esters of those fatty acids, but instead of with an alcohol like glycerol, they're going to be bound to a non-lipid substance other than alcohol, such as a protein, a carbohydrate, or a phosphate group. Okay, so think of the simple lipids as being attached to an alcohol, okay, such as glycerol, all those triglycerides, diglycerides, monoglycerides. These guys are a little bit different, okay? So these guys are our phospholipids, okay, bound to a phosphate group, glycolipids bound to a sugar, and lipoproteins bound to a protein. Okay, so these guys are kind of our different group of lipids that a lot of people don't think about, right? So we're pretty familiar probably with our triglycerides, the fat, right? So that's pretty common, but these guys we kind of forget about. We also have our sterols, which are our steroid alcohols, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But just to show you kind of some pictures of what some of these things look like. So on the bottom left is a phospholipid. So the phospholipid structure are two fatty acid chains attached to a phosphate group off the glycerol. Okay, so it has that phosphate group on there, which creates it into a phospholipid. These guys are what make up our cellular membranes. Okay, so we have a phospholipid bilayer that we'll talk about in a minute to make up that cell membrane. And then on the bottom right hand side we have what's called a lipoprotein. Okay, so a structure of a lipoprotein where essentially instead of a bilayer of those phospholipids, it's going to create one layer around the outside, kind of like a shell, and then you're going to have some cholesterol and triglycerol inside the little ball of phospholipids essentially. Okay, it creates this little kind of spherical structure with stuff inside of it. Okay, and we'll talk about why these lipoproteins are important in a minute. Okay. So let's go through some of these more complex lipids a little more closely. But as we go through this, remember what the core of a lipid means. It means that it doesn't dissolve in water, and we have a term for that, and that's hydrophobic, meaning it doesn't like water, right? So it's not going to mix with water. And this is going to be very important as we continue our conversation with lipids. So these phospholipids are very important for our cell membrane structure, but they're also important for lipid transport in the body, in the blood. Because what is blood made out of? Mostly, right? Mostly blood is water, right? So how do we transport these lipid molecules in the blood if it doesn't like water, right? If it doesn't like to be in water, how do we get it around? So these are where these phospholipid kind of structures come into play and are very important. So these phospholipids come together in a bilayer to create a cell membrane. Okay, so if we kind of go back to basic biology and our different structures of the cell membrane is made up of these phospholipids. So if you notice, it's a bilayer, meaning you have two layers of phospholipids. Now, the tails of those phospholipids, we said, are fatty acids. And fatty acids are lipids, right? So they don't like water. They're hydrophobic. So they're going to turn in on each other because they'd rather be next to each other than facing out into the fluid, the extracellular fluid, intracellular fluid, that's all water, right? And what happens is, what's really important is that it has a hydrophilic head, and that's where that phosphate group comes into play. So those heads of the phospholipids are hydrophilic. They don't mind being next to the water. So they're going to face outward and face the water, okay? Protecting kind of that hydrophobic tail in the middle. And that's how we get a bilayer, and it creates our cell membrane all the way around, okay? So on one side you have extracellular or outside the cell, and it's usually fluid, right? And then you have intracellular inside the cell, which is also fluid, water, okay? Now, if you don't create a bilayer, you can actually create some other kind of spherical structures. And we already kind of talked about the lipoprotein. We'll talk a little bit more about that specific structure, but we have some other ones called micelles and liposomes. Okay, so micelles just take one layer of phospholipids, okay, not two to create a bilayer like the bottom, just one. And what is it going to do? It's going to create this sphere because all those tails are going to want to group together away from the water, okay, leaving that hydrophilic phosphate group head on the outside. Okay, so that micelle is just one layer and it's going to come all the way around, okay, and create this kind of spherical structure. Now, a liposome is very similar, but again, you're going to have this phospholipid bilayer, but it's going to come all the way around and create a circle, a spherical structure, okay? So kind of like a small cell, right? Because that essentially is a cell. You just put a bunch of organelles in the middle and you've got a cell. Okay, so liposome is just a simplified version of that. Okay, and we'll talk about why these guys are important, because now you've created kind of a protected area inside, right, where fat is okay to live, especially in that micelle, because it doesn't want to touch that outer water. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit more about some of these other complex lipids. So we've seen glycolipids before, and we just talked about lipoproteins a little bit as well. So let's go through them in more detail. So glycolipids, if we break it down, it's a lipid with a carbohydrate chain attached to it. And these guys are important in the cell membrane structure. So they're very important for cell-to-cell communication. So if we look at our bottom left-hand picture, we've got our phospholipid bilayer creating that cell membrane. We've got some proteins in there. And then you notice we've got these little chains of things sticking up out of the membrane. And one of those is a glycolipid. So we have glycolipids, we have glycoproteins as well. Okay. So these guys just are a chain of carbohydrates sticking up out of the cell membrane. Okay, so it helps to tell the different cells what type of cell they are. Like, it's good for cell identification and things like that. Now we also have lipoproteins. Okay, so those lipoproteins are very similar to liposomes, very similar, right? You have this outer phospholipid layer, and you actually have a core of fat and cholesterol, okay? Now, the fat and cholesterol in there doesn't like water, right? So it's a way to transport these hydrophobic molecules such as fat and cholesterol in water, blood, and other bodily fluids. And the outer membrane, that lipid membrane, has these different proteins in it as well, okay? And so there's a lot of different types of lipoproteins, okay? The chylomicron being the most simplified form of a lipoprotein. But then we have these different lipoproteins that are termed low density, high density, very low density. And so they have different functions, and we talk about these guys in terms of the cholesterol that they're carrying around. So you've heard of kind of bad cholesterol, good cholesterol, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But these are lipoproteins. Okay, so they have this lipid membrane with some proteins in it, and inside is a core of some sort of fat, cholesterol they're carrying around the body to avoid that mixing of the fat and the water. Okay. All right, so what is the difference between these different lipoproteins? So remember, lipoproteins are carrying cholesterol. So a lot of times people are just talking about your cholesterol levels in your body, but really they're talking about these lipoprotein molecules that are carrying the cholesterol around your body. We haven't talked about cholesterol just yet because we haven't gotten to it, but cholesterol can be very good for us, but it can also be bad for us as well, right? Most people think of cholesterol as being bad. Now, why is it bad? Okay, so we have these low density lipoproteins and high density lipoproteins. Now we need cholesterol in our cells, we need it to make hormones, we need it for a lot of things in our body. So we have to be able to transport that cholesterol around our body, and that's the job of the lipoprotein. Okay, so the low density lipoprotein is what kind of transports and stores cholesterol within the bloodstream. Okay, so that's kind of that main transport throughout the body, which it's required, right? Because we need that cholesterol. But if you have too much of it, what happens is it starts to stick to the walls of your blood vessels. And that's where you get those plaques or those they call them cholesterol plaques, but it's really accumulation of these low density lipoprotein molecules carrying and storing that cholesterol. But you actually have another type, which is the high density lipoprotein, or considered the good cholesterol, because what it does is it goes around and kind of picks up those LDL and the cholesterol that's stuck in the arteries or in the blood vessels and takes it back to the liver. Okay, so the LDL is what's carrying the cholesterol through the bloodstream to your cells, which is good, right? We need it. But then the HDL is going to kind of pick it up and kind of remove all that excess cholesterol and LDL and take it back to the liver to convert it into bile salts. Don't really need to worry about kind of all the anatomy and physiology of it, but just to kind of give you an idea of, when people are talking about cholesterol in the body, it's actually, cholesterol is not a bad thing, right? We need cholesterol. Too much cholesterol can be a bad thing. So go ahead and watch the video I have posted on Canvas about kind of the differences between LDL and HDL and why they're important. Okay. So now let's talk about that cholesterol, which is a type of sterol. So sterols are these derived lipids that are kind of in this carbon ring-like structure. So instead of this kind of the carbon chains in those fatty acids, now we're going to create these kind of ring-like structures. And they occur naturally in a lot of different things, such as plants, animals, and even fungi. And even some bacteria can produce sterols as well. So the one we're most concerned about is cholesterol when we're talking about, diet and nutrition. But cholesterol is important in the body, right? We need cholesterol. We just said it's part of our cell membrane. We create hormones with it, specifically sex hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, things like that. But we also produce bile acids. So we produce bile acids, which are very important in breaking down our nutrients in our body as well, and it's all produced in the liver. But what a lot of people don't know is that there are plant sterols as well, and these guys are very important, and they actually have been found to help lower the cholesterol in our body. Okay, so phytosterols are plant-based sterols. Okay. So this is just a little bit more about what plant sterols are and how they work. So it's just kind of, a little bit for your edification. You don't need to know the details about phytosterols, but just know that they can help absorb cholesterol, which can lower that LDL in the blood, which is that low density lipoprotein that carries cholesterol around. Okay. So now that we know a bit about fatty acids, we know about our triglycerides and some of these simple versus complex lipids, let's talk about these essential fatty acids. And by essential, we mean that they're not synthesized in the body, so we can't make them ourselves, so we actually have to consume them in our diet. Okay. So we have what are called omega fatty acids, and there's two major classes of omega fatty acids. And these guys are polyunsaturated fatty acids. So remember we said those unsaturated fatty acids have the double bonded carbons, so they have a kink, and poly just means there's multiple of those double bound carbons, right? And the nickname for them are PUFAs, because we don't really want to say polyunsaturated fatty acids over and over again. So these PUFAs are considered omega fatty acids, okay? So these guys are all polyunsaturated fatty acids, and the ones that are essential, okay, are the ones that we need to get from our diet. So we have an omega-3 fatty acid, linolenic acid, and an omega-6 fatty acid, linoleic acid. And arachidonic acid is also thrown in there because some species do require it as an essential fatty acid. But the two main ones are linolenic and linoleic acid. Now notice they're quite similar, right? So notice that spelling difference there. So why do we need essential fatty acids, right? So we don't make them, we need them in our diet. What are the functions of them in the body? Well, we require them in our cell membrane, just like a lot of fatty acids and fats, they are required for the cell membrane. They also are precursors for eicosanoids. And eicosanoids are inflammatory compounds, so essentially our inflammatory pathway requires these eicosanoids. So we don't need to go into detail of the inflammatory pathway or anything like that, but if you want to look it up, you're totally welcome to. You just don't need to know the details, but just know that they're important for our inflammatory pathway, which is important, right, for our immune system and inflammation in the body, which a lot of people think, okay, well, inflammation is bad, but we do require inflammation to protect ourselves for certain things, okay? But inflammation can get out of control as well. We also need them for our nervous system, so such as our myelin sheaths around our neurons, in the retina of the eye, right, in the back of the eye. So they are some constituents in the nervous system that are very important, especially for development of the nervous system. They are required for reproduction and are regulators of gene transcription, which is very important when we're turning those genes into proteins and regulating that whole process. So lots of things that we require these essential fatty acids for, okay? So you don't need to memorize this slide. It's just showing you the differences between omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids. So omega-3 fatty acids are kind of considered non-inflammatory. DHA is kind of, a lot of people add the DHA into milk and things like that because it's kind of the last step of converting that linolenic acid in this process. But it's really minimally inflammatory, so a lot of people think omega-3 fatty acids are better for you. Omega-6 fatty acids tend to be more pro-inflammatory, so they kind of provide you with all those pro-inflammatory precursors, those eicosanoids, prostaglandins, things like that. But again, very important, but we don't need maybe as much of them as maybe they say, and it can be kind of pro-inflammatory if you eat too many omega-6 fatty acids. And if you notice, linoleic acid and linolenic are those first precursors, right? So those are our two main essential fatty acids. And we had arachidonic acid on there because some animals can't do that conversion from linoleic acid to arachidonic acid. So that's why sometimes we require arachidonic acid as an essential fatty acid. And then this just shows you the top 10 foods with the highest kind of omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, meaning they have more omega-3 fatty acids than omega-6. So they're kind of considered, non-inflammatory and are maybe considered better for you because they have more of those omega-3 fatty acids than the omega-6. Okay. And if you notice on here, this is all fairly healthy food, right? So this is just kind of an oversimplified or maybe exaggerated, representation of the omega-3 fatty acids. Everybody's really on board with, how important and how healthy omega-3 fatty acids are. Some of these things are, proven, some maybe not so much, but, overall it's really going to give you a lot of health benefits to consume omega-3 fatty acids. Not only are they required, they're essential, right, but they are good for us as well. So we've talked about our essential fatty acids and what their functions are and why they're required, but now let's go back kind of to the general functions of lipids in the body. Why do we need lipids, right? So not only do we need those essential fatty acids, that's number 2, but they also can provide energy. And you guessed it, fat is the best energy. So if you look at the actual energy content of food, fat has the most amount of energy per gram. So protein, carbs are about the same, right? Sugar is even a little lower. Dietary fiber is even lower than that. And then you have fat, which is super high, right? It's much higher, almost double than all these other sources of energy. So really, fat is a wonderful source of energy, and I think a lot of people forget that as well. If you eat a diet that has a healthy amount of fat in it, you're less hungry down the road because you're actually really meeting your energy requirements a lot better than if you were to have carbohydrates or even protein. Because we'll talk about why our body doesn't prefer to use protein as energy. We need protein for a lot of other things in our body besides energy. So, fat is the go-to source of energy. Go figure. It kind of all comes back to that. Maybe we were wrong about the low-fat diets because now everybody's eating carbohydrates and sugar, and we turn all those carbohydrates and sugar into fat. So, kind of backwards thinking there, right? So, what else does fat do? It's a carrier for all those fat-soluble vitamins. Okay, so we'll talk about all of our vitamins in another lecture, but we do have 4 vitamins that are fat soluble, meaning they can only dissolve in fat, they do not dissolve in water, and they're very important vitamins. and we'll talk about them. So A, D, E, and K. They're also important for the cell membrane. We've already kind of covered that, right? So all those phospholipids, glycolipids, all those guys in the cell membrane that are very important, okay? So now let's go through some of these functions in a little bit more detail. So I kind of touched on them a bit, but let's go through them. So how do we actually get energy from lipids? So we have to break down those triglycerides, right, into the glycerol and the 3 free fatty acids. And digestibility is pretty good. It's about 80% for our fats, our lipids. Obviously, waxes and sterols, we can't really digest them very well. So the triglycerides are really what we are digesting. So even the mono and di triglycerides as well, but are mono diglycerides as well as triglycerides. And there's really no dietary requirement for lipids. So it doesn't say you need to eat, this amount of triglycerides. We just know that we need those essential fatty acids. So they're the only ones that we actually have a dietary requirement for. But if you don't eat enough fat, we do know that it can lead to vitamin deficiencies as well, because we'll talk about those fat-soluble vitamins, right? So you actually break down those triglycerides with an enzyme, lipase, and water, right? So you break it down and you break those bonds from the glycerol from those free fatty acids, and then you can use those free fatty acids and even glycerol as energy. So lipids, triglycerides, right, are all sources of these essential fatty acids. Okay, so we need the linoleic and linolenic acids, the omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids. Now remember, those guys are polyunsaturated fatty acids, so that's what they are. And again, some need arachidonic acid. Now, if you don't get some of these essential fatty acids, there are some deficiencies associated with them. The most common is probably dermatitis, where you get kind of a scaly, itchy skin. And that can be, a sign, a symptom of a deficiency in an essential fatty acid. There can be more problems internally if you don't get those essential fatty acids, but this is kind of an outward symptom of a deficiency. So we also need lipids to be able to carry and absorb those fat-soluble vitamins. So it's really required to digest, absorb, and transport those vitamins into our cells and into our body, because they are carried by those transport lipids we talked about, those micelles and lipoproteins, where those phospholipids kind of create those spherical structures to help carry the lipids inside of them. So if we break down that kind of food substance, right, to be able to absorb that fat, which includes those vitamins, we need to have the fat available to create those transport micelles and lipoproteins to be able to increase that bioavailability of the vitamin, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to transport it across the cells and into the body, okay? So I think we've discussed at length probably the function of lipids in the cell membrane, right? So that phospholipid bilayer, cholesterol, all those glycolipids that are all very important for structural support, cell signaling, communication, all very important in the function of our cell membrane. So I think we've got that down pretty well. So now let's talk a little bit about lipid metabolism. So how do we actually absorb lipids in our body? How do we utilize them? So what is the process? So first we have to absorb the fat, the lipid, into our bloodstream, into our system. So how do we actually get it there, especially since we said fat doesn't like water, right? So this is going to really be where a lot of those transport molecules come into play. So the majority of our absorption of fat does happen in the small intestine. So once you leave the stomach, you're going to hit the duodenum in the small intestine, and that's where these bile acids and pancreatic enzymes are going to break down those triglycerides, the fat molecules, into free fatty acids and some monoglycerides as well. Okay. Now, if we break them down, right, so we break down into these free fatty acids that don't like water, all of that, we're going to create micelles, right? So we said that those micelles are those phospholipid spherical structures that can encase our fats for us. So they're going to encase those fatty acids and those monoglycerides into these micelles. Okay, so the bile acids break it down, and we said that cholesterol is needed to create those bile acids also. So we actually use fat to create bile acids, which break down fat. So it's kind of a nice big, circular thing that's happening in the body. Okay, recycling, right? So essentially we create these micelles, which they can then be absorbed by the cells, okay? So there's two different ways that we can actually absorb fats or fatty acids, okay? So the portal system is how we absorb protein and sugars, carbohydrates, go through the portal system, which is going to the liver. Okay, so we essentially go to the liver for processing. Now, glycerol and short chain fatty acids, or those volatile fatty acids, can go through the portal system because they're small enough. Okay. But these longer chain fatty acids actually have to go through the lymphatic system. And instead of those small micelles, they actually require those lipoproteins. And the most simplified lipoprotein was those chylomicrons. So the chylomicrons actually take those longer chain fatty acids and they go into the lymphatic system. So hopefully you've had, some anatomy, some physiology, and are familiar with the lymphatic system. But the lymphatic system picks up kind of all the, extra fluid and things around the cell, and it brings it through our lymph nodes to kind of make sure there aren't any bad bacteria, things like that. And then it goes back to the blood vessels that go to the heart. So it does eventually go through the bloodstream. So it kind of is a long way around essentially to get back to the bloodstream, going through that lymphatic system. But the problem is some of these fats are just too big to be picked up by the bloodstream, by the capillaries around the cells in the digestive tract. So they have to go through the lymphatic system because it's a little bit bigger. Okay, so I want you guys to know, that's why I bolded it, that some of these lipids have to go through the lymphatic system to get into the bloodstream and be absorbed. Okay. So I like this image, and I even have a video for you guys to watch as well for fat metabolism and absorption. But essentially, this is a great video this picture is really good to show you how we break down all those fatty acids and monoglycerides, and they actually kind of come back together in the cell to become a triglyceride again. And so these are those bigger triglycerides that cannot go through the portal system, through the capillary. So they have to actually go through the lacteal, which is part of the lymphatic system. So it just shows you kind of how this happens. And again, you don't need to know every single step of lipid metabolism and absorption, but I just want you to be aware that there are some differences with fat absorption in comparison to carbohydrate and protein metabolism. Okay. So I have a video there. I highly recommend watching it, especially to be a little more clear about what's going on with lipid metabolism. So we know now how we absorb lipids, right? We have to break them down and we have to transport them. So how do we transport them? Well, blood transports the triglycerides and cholesterol in those lipoproteins, and those are then delivered to the liver and the tissues. So we talked about the lipoproteins and our different, LDL versus HDL. And now we talked a little bit about the chylomicron transporting it into the lymphatic system to get into the bloodstream. So these are kind of those different lipoproteins to be able to transport our triglycerides and our cholesterol in the bloodstream. Okay. So we talked about the breakdown of the triglycerides into fatty acids and then utilizing those fatty acids for energy. So we actually can and you don't need to know how we do this, but essentially in the mitochondria, we do oxidize those fatty acids to be able to enter the cellular respiration cycle. So we talked about how glucose enters the cycle, and we said that we can utilize fatty acids in the cell cycle as well for energy. So that's how we utilize those free fatty acids for energy. Okay. So don't panic when you see this picture. It's just showing you the difference that we just said, how our fatty acids are going to enter the cell cycle instead of glucose. So we said glucose undergoes that first step of glycolysis to be able to be turned into pyruvate, which will then become acetyl-CoA. So essentially we bypass that glycolysis step with the fatty acids and we oxidize them to become that acetyl-CoA. And then that can enter the TCA, Krebs cycle, a lot of different names for that cell cycle there, which is then what's going to create all of that energy for us in the cell. Okay. So one thing is too that when we do utilize fatty acids for energy, we create those ketone bodies. So we talked a little bit about ketones and ketosis when we were talking about some glucose metabolism problems, right? Especially in dairy cattle, because especially they're using a lot of those volatile fatty acids for energy. Okay. So where is all this lipid metabolism happening? Well, it's really happening in the liver. So the liver is really the central organ for lipid, interconversion and metabolism. So we said that we can use fatty acids in the cell cycle, right? We turn it into acetyl-CoA and that can enter the Krebs cycle, which will then give us energy. But we also can create steroids and bile acids in the liver as well from cholesterol. So cholesterol is needed to create those steroids and bile acids that the bile acids help to break down fats as well. So remember we said it's a nice big cycle. But we do get these ketones. So ketones are continuously produced from lipid metabolism. So the more we break down our fat into those fatty acids, the more ketones we get, and we actually can utilize ketones as energy. And so a lot of people think that ketones may be bad, and a huge buildup of ketones probably isn't very good, right? You could go into ketosis. But there is, we do utilize them as energy, and they are a good source of energy. So this is just showing you kind of the breakdown of how we utilize glycerol and fatty acids for energy. So if we break down those triglycerides, what is the component, right? We get glycerol and we get fatty acids. So the glycerol we can turn into glucose, into energy. So that's a direct way we can utilize that. But then those ketones we can actually utilize as energy in different cells in our body as well, even in the brain and the muscles. So we can utilize ketones into energy. So this is just kind of a way that you can follow the lines and how we utilize it. So again, you don't really need to memorize this. It's just showing you how we can break down fat into energy and why it's a really good source of energy, because you get, glycerol, you get fatty acids, which can all give you good energy, even more so than carbohydrates and protein. So we store our excess energy as fat in the body, right? So we store excess energy as triglycerides in these fat cells called adipocytes. And so we have these adipocytes in all of our tissues. And so we have a slide here on the left-hand side to show you what those fat cells look like. So those big white kind of round circular structures, those are adipocytes or fat cells. And so the white part is the actual stored fat, the triglycerides in those cells. And so I have a drawing here of just what an adipocyte looks like, okay? So we have adipose tissue, kind of all throughout our body, fat tissue. There's places that we have more adipose tissue than others. And fat deposition, or this adipose tissue, can be different between sexes and between species. Where we carry our fat stores can be different, right? But the point is that we all have this adipose tissue, and we have a certain amount of these fat cells, and then we can fill them up with our fat reservoir in those cells, okay? So that's how we store our energy as fat. And again, this excess energy is usually in the form of sugar, right? So we usually store and convert sugar into triglycerides and into fat. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of body condition scores if you're not already utilizing them for the animals in the zoo. This is just, definitely something to know about. So we use body condition scores to assess body weight and fat deposition across the body to tell the health of not only ourselves, but also animals. So because we said that different species can carry fat in different locations, this is a good way to be able to utilize that knowledge to say, okay, what's too fat, what's an ideal weight, what's too thin, and you can usually find these body condition charts or scores for different species, especially in our domestic world. We have quite a few of them. And so you can say, okay, this is what the animal looks like, where the fat deposition is, and we can score them on a body condition chart, okay? So what can affect lipid metabolism? what affects our body to say, hey, we need to start breaking down either the fat in our body or consuming the fat and breaking it down for energy. So the frequency of feeding, right? So there's kind of this different idea between meal feeding and free feeding in animals. So that can definitely affect it. So if you're meal feeding, you're going to have times of fasting in between. And that can be really important for breaking down the fat stores and the energy stores in the body in between those meals. Whereas some people choose to free feed, right? And that may not allow that downtime of fasting in between. Because fasting is really important. So fasting can affect lipid metabolism. Because if you fast, you're going to deplete those glycogen stores first and then fat. So it just depends on the amount and the length of fasting. Dietary carbohydrates. So that does play an effect on lipid metabolism. So our triglyceride and cholesterol levels seem to be more elevated in a high sugar diet, a high sucrose diet. So that can definitely affect it as well. So you're actually creating more fat when you eat higher sugar diets, right? Which makes sense. A lot of people just don't equate, sugar to fat. They equate fat to fat, and that's not necessarily true. So let's talk a little bit about lipid disorders. So obesity is a big one, right? Especially here in America, almost 50% of adults in America are obese. Now that is just kind of a crazy thought when you think about it, right? So there is a big relationship between obesity and cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. So we talked a little bit about diabetes last lecture, having to do kind of with carbohydrate metabolism, right? So our insulin is supposed to make our cells utilize the carbohydrates, but then when we get too obese, our cells quit listening to the insulin, right? So that's a big one, right? And animal models have been used to study obesity. And unfortunately now we're seeing more obesity in our domestic animals as well, because we are using the same mentality that we use for ourselves and overfeeding our animals, which is why those body condition scores are so important. And so important about educating people on, healthy nutrition and healthy diets for animals. There is a strong genetic basis for obesity in certain regions and certain groups of people, but nutrition is really to blame. Okay. And if you want to see a really good documentary on obesity, watch the movie Fed Up, and I believe it is on Netflix. It's just a very good, very eye-opening documentary. So fatty livers can be another problem, kind of across species, but in humans definitely. There are some species we worry about fatty livers as well. And essentially it's the increased accumulation of lipids in the liver. And what happens is it can really decrease liver function. But we said that the liver was really the main organ for lipid metabolism, right? So we send all of our fats there to be processed and everything. So lots of things can cause fatty livers. So a high fat or high cholesterol diet can cause a fatty liver, okay, because you're breaking down all that fat, sending all that cholesterol to the liver. But also an excessive carbohydrate diet as well, because we do say that we turn sugar into fat, right? It's just an excessive energy diet, essentially, right? But the opposite side is also true. So say you, want to lose weight, you want to get rid of your fat, which is great, But if you increase the lipid breakdown in your fat tissue around your body, it's all going to go to the liver. So that people have found is a problem if people, have excessive weight loss or rapid weight loss, things like that, can cause fatty livers as well. So, then you can say, well, how do we win here, right? But obviously it's trying to balance everything in terms of, not eating excessive energy and not, breaking down too much of the fat tissue too rapidly as well. So, so fatty livers can be a problem. So another disorder we see is called atherosclerosis. And essentially that's that plaque buildup in our blood vessels, especially in our arteries. So we have, too much of that LDL, that low density lipoprotein carrying the cholesterol through the blood, and it gets really sticky and it sticks to the walls of the arteries, and you can create blood clots, blockages in these arteries from the atherosclerotic plaques. And of course, there is some association with, higher saturated fat diets versus unsaturated fat diets. So that's where that kind of saturated fat gets a bad rap because they are high in cholesterol. And so you do get a buildup of that LDL, low density lipoprotein, okay? And that's the bad cholesterol. That's the one that we don't really want to increase, okay? So I know that was a long lecture. Fat is really interesting, and again, I think it really gets a bad rap, but it's really important and it's really interesting. So that's it for fat, and next week we are going to finish off this unit with proteins and amino acids. So that'll finish up this unit, and then we'll have our exam the week after that. Okay? Thank you guys. I'll see you next week.